Hello learners, welcome to this online session. In today's online session, I'm going to talk about literary beginnings of Canadian literature during the period of postmodernism, post-nationalism. Okay, and in the previous class, I've talked about pre-Confederation poets, Confederation poets. Okay, I've given you background of that as well. So today I'm going to talk about Canadian nationalism, post-nationalism, postmodernism phase now. So when you talk about Canadian nationalism, it was challenged particularly in the 1980s. Okay, when Canada signed a treaty for establishment of free trade between Canada and the United States, which finally resulted in North American Free Trade Agreement, which is known as NAFTA. Okay, establishing a kind of a free trade between Canada, United States, and Mexico also in the 1990s. So keeping this, in the background, there is a poet, writer, whose name is Frank Davy. Okay, Frank Davy, in his book called Post-National Arguments: The Politics of the Anglophone Canadian Novel, since 1967, he analyzes 16, post-centennial novels to announce the arrival of post-national state, a state invisible to its own citizens. Okay, so in fact, it's with the coming of this book, which is entitled, Post-National Arguments, the Politics of the Anglophone Canadian Novel since 1967, obviously by Frank Davy, that people start talking about the whole discourse of the post-national state, okay, national state. And this, what is of importance to all of us is that, Davy is giving us very, very important, understandings about, this post-nationalism, and he is of the view that there exists a heterogeneity, okay, heterogeneity of Canadian discursive field. So obviously he is bringing in an element of heterogeneity, okay, through his whole Canadian discourse, which he's writing about, and he is obviously, making us aware of the fact that Canadian discursive field, okay, Canadian discourse, literary discourse particularly, is characterized by the whole, idea element of heterogeneity. And he also observes today such as gender, class, region, ethnicity, and economic structures, etc. All this they mark text as decisively as nation or world culture. So they are all becoming part of the world culture. Okay, so and thus usual there is kind of a relationship between literary codes or positions and between gender, class, region, ethnic affiliations, and economic practices. Okay, which is you can say essentially that of contestation and dominance. So he is, and apart from telling us about the heterogeneity, bringing another element to the whole Canadian discourse, which is that he's saying that there is an element of contestation, that elements of dominance is there, or no? So apart from talking about heterogeneity, element of heterogeneity, where he's talking about how even gender, class, region, ethnicity, these are all becoming a part of this whole Canadian culture. He's also saying that there is kind of an idea of contestation, okay, which is very much present there. And he is also talking about the whole concept of multiculturalism, and in the age of multinational capitalism, Canadian nationalism, he says, can survive only by participating in the arguments of a nation that is being continuously discursively produced and reproduced from political contestation. So there is no denying the fact that there was kind of a political contestation existing there. And he is talking about Davy is talking about, you can say, how this political contestation was existing there continuously. It was discursively produced. Okay, discursively means through discourses. It could be literary discourses, political discourses, you can say. Okay, so there is multinational whole issue of multinational capitalism was being discursively produced, okay, and reproduced, okay, from political contestation. And it is this political contestation that forms fertile ground, kind of fertile ground for the postmodern Canadian poets, okay, and even postmodern Canadian writers, okay, as postmodernism presents a kind of a challenge to the concept of a coherent identity that has the power to impose order upon the environment, okay, which really questions the ontological, certainty located at the core of modernism, I mean, so what postmodernism in fact does is, no, I mean, is to really, I mean, contest the modernist elements which were present. And modernism is essentially characterized by, I mean, certain established norms, certain established practices, cultures, which people are supposed to follow. But postmodernism is, I mean, sort of contesting those pre-established norms. It's saying no. So postmodern elements are just, I mean, contesting and just deconstructing those pre-established norms. Okay, they are questioning, they are problematizing, all forms of ontological certainty which are located at the core of modernism. So they do not agree with modernist elements. So postmodernists, they are, just problematizing, they are questioning all kinds of ontological certainties, okay, which were located at the core of modernism. And in its race, in its race to homogenize, I mean, postmodernists also, sort of, they try to, I mean, particularly during modernism. So modernism, what is happening is that, I mean, the people are trying to homogenize, universalize, so modernism try to, obliterate or even gloss over the cultural, historical, sociological, even gendered and other differences, okay, by just, I mean, establishing certain norms and regulations, certain frameworks, okay, and respecting, I mean, differences and otherness, okay. Postmodernism is encouraging. So in modernism, what is happening is that there is an attempt to obliterate over the cultural, historical, sociological, and gender differences. During postmodernism, also, what is happening is that postmodernism is, respecting, all kinds of, you can say, differences, otherness, by encouraging, identity politics, which are based on gender, which are based on class, region, ethnic, even religious affiliations, economic practices, or cultural orientations. Okay, so we see a little bit, you can say, difference between these two, though there are, convergent elements also between these two, modernism and postmodernism. During postmodernism, we also get to know about, multiculturalism. Okay, elements of multiculturalism are very much present, and multiculturalism, highlighting multiple cultures, highlighting, heritage languages, regional identities, nativism. This really augments, really, develops the postmodernist agenda. So multiculturalism. Even now, I mean, Canada is a multicultural nation, which is promoting, various kinds of cultures, multiple languages, okay, regional identities, etc. And there is one famous, I mean, writer whose name is Margaret Lawrence, and Margaret Lawrence was one of the first writers, supporting this agenda, okay, supporting this whole idea of multiculturalism. So let me briefly talk about Margaret Lawrence, because it's very important to understand as to, I mean, how he supported, postmodernist elements. Uh, he asserted, regional identity, by making the small prairie town of Nepawa in Manitoba. She, okay, and, I mean, she also, established the center of her fictional world in a place, okay, Manitoba, which was, I mean, promoted as Manawai, okay, and she found a permanent place in the Canadian literary canon. So Canadian people know her, okay, for her works, okay, and largely because, she spent, I mean, most of the times in Africa, and then when she came to Canada, I mean, she writes about the Canadian spirit also. So we'll talk about that. And she, in fact, was the major novelist in the 1960s and 70s. So she is known in Canada for her works during the 60s and 70s, and her five interrelated works of fiction beginning with The Stone Angel, which was published in 1964, and it concludes with The Diviners, which was published in 1974. And in fact, The Diviners happens to be the most influential novel of hers, okay, which was written by her. And as far as her background is concerned, I mean she was born in the town of Nipawa, which has a fictional name, Manawaka, which has a fictional name. Okay, and she felt a sense of entrapment here, like her highly autobiographical character, who was known as Vanessa MacLeod in her stories. Okay, collected in a book called A Bird in the House, and that book, A Bird in the House, was published in 1970. Okay, and she married a person called Jack Lawrence in 1948. Having married Jack Lawrence in 1948, she went with him to live first in England and then in Africa. So having lived in England, I mean, she worked there and stayed there for a few years, and after that she went to Africa, entitled A Tree for Poetry, which was published in 1954, is a translation and recasting of Somali poetry and tales. So obviously African language, Somali. So it was translated, and okay, it's a translated casting of Somali poetry and tales. Okay. And her African stories that started published in 1954 were collected in another book, which is known as, you can say, The Tomorrow Tamer. So, okay, and she wrote three other African books. Okay, while This Side Jordan, which was published in 1960, is a novel which deals with Ghana's independence, and The Prophet's Camel Bale, which was published in 1963, is a memoir that deals with her years in Somaliland. And there's another book which is entitled Long Drums and Cannons, which was published in 1968, is a critical study of some emerging Nigerian writers such as Chinua Achebe. And we know, Chinua Achebe, who happens to be a world-known figure, who's written a novel called Things Fall Apart, which has become a kind of, you can say, a bestseller, and it has also become part of syllabi for the postgraduate students in the English departments of all over the world. So I mean, she encouraged Nigerian writer. Okay, and Africa thus formed a very crucible, okay, for her, in which she put her Canadian experience. So when she went to Africa, she put her Canadian experience, to examine some of the major themes in her fiction. Africa also, sort of sharpened her sense of Canada as a new country, okay, that was coming to grips with colonialism. So she is, depicting, she is, sort of talking about that issue. She's bringing out that issue of, Canada, okay, as a new country coming to grips with colonialism. And with this most valuable expatriate experience which she was having, I mean, Margaret Lawrence came back to Canada and got separated from her husband. Okay, and after she got separated, she moved to England. Okay, where she wrote the first three Manawaka novels. Okay, which are entitled The Stone Angel, A Jest of God, which was published in 1966, The Fire Dwellers, which was published in 1969. So first two books, okay, first two novels, The Stone Angel and A Jest of God, were published in 1966, whereas the third one, The Fire Dwellers, was published in 1969. And she was thus established as the foremost Canadian novelist of the decade. And regionalism was, now established as a force to reckon with in Canadian literature. Because she's talking about that, she's bringing out the element of regionalism in her writings, And her best known novel is none other than The Diviners, which was published in 1974, completing the cycle of fiction brought together themes and characters of all the other four Manawaka novels. So she, extensively, bringing all the elements of Canadian things, you can say, in her best novel, The Diviners. Okay, in The Diviners. Now, let me briefly talk about The Diviners. And The Diviners, has been called, large. It was published in 1974. You should be all knowing that. Okay, and it has been called, a large, risky, and experimental postmodern novel, okay, The Diviners. And that has also been appreciated, for its feminism. She is bringing the element of feminism. She is raising this issue of feminism in this novel, The Diviners. And you can just wonder, in 1974 she's talking about that, and it moves away from realism when it uses such techniques as, you can say, memory bank movie, a flashback inserted as a set of pieces into the narrative that uses the point of view of Logan Christie, who happens to be a garbage collector. Is a person who is a garbage collector, whose view of the seamy side of the town is passed down to a young orphan, Morrigan. So he happens to be, Logan Christie is one of the important characters. And the novel, this man, becomes a meta history, making a statement about life in Canada, because she herself is writing about her life in Canada. She's also simultaneously talking about other people's lives in Canada. Okay, and it happens to be epic in sweep, epic in sweep. And this novel touches upon the historical events of the settlement of the Scottish pioneers, okay, on the prairies, resulting in the displacement of the Indian and the Métis, who happen to be the mixed bloods or mixed breeds. Okay. Now, Canadian nationalism thus undergoes a kind of a transformation, change to make a post-national argument, which would, include all the marginalized native, male, be it male people, female, and other voices to construct a postmodern Canada. So when we talk about Canadian nationalism, so it's undergoing a tremendous change where they are trying to incorporate everybody. They're trying to give voice to everybody, including the marginalized people, okay, marginalized male, female, or even other oppressed voices. So they are getting, a robust voice, okay, in this novel, okay, The Diviners, which is very, very important novel. Now, having talked about, now let me talk about another novelist, okay, whose name is Robert Croix. Robert Croix. And Robert Croix was born in a small prairie town in Alberta. Okay, so he was born in Alberta, and he grew up during the Depression of 1930s. Obviously, we will see him, incorporating issues related to depression of 1930. Instead of taking up a somber view of life, he is best known as a comic novelist. Okay, because he engages comic elements into his novel, and his novels use great myths to tell tall tales, blending classical mythology and North American Indian tales. He is also, drawing upon some fantasy elements of fantasy, some elements of comedy, which are being the two modes that he is fond of. So he's fond of, fantasy elements. He's fond of comic elements also. And apart from that, apart from using these two modes, modes of fantasy and comedy, he is also parodying, as much as he parallels. So he satirizes, he brings, the whole, satire, figure of speech of satire. He's using that as a tool, and he's also drawing parallels in between. Okay, and this makes him, sort of a doyen of Canadian postmodernism, and he is well known for his comic elements. Okay, and he is in fact known as a comic novelist. So he is also one of the well-known novelists of Canada. In 1965, Croix, he published his first novel, which was entitled "But We Are Exiles." Okay, so that was, which was published by him. Okay, so Croix, in his book "But We Are Exiles," he is sharing his own real experiences of working on Mackenzie River, particularly on river boats. However, what happens is that he moves away from realism to myth and fable in his trilogy. He's publishing three books. Okay, later on, first was entitled "The Words," of My Roaring, which was published in 1966. The second book was entitled The Stud Horseman, which was published in 1969. And finally, the third one was entitled Gone Indian, which was published in 1973. Now, he investigates and imagined, Alberta landscape, through the 4 decades, almost 40 years, 30 to 70s, okay, 40 years. And he is touching upon some of the beautiful landscapes, Alberta landscapes, okay. He makes reference to that Alberta landscape in his trilogy books, okay. And he very playfully he considers the Great Depression years, not only depression. If you remember, I told you he was born in 1930, and 1930 was depression year. So he's talking about depression years. He's talking about the Second World War, okay, Second World War, the native pastoralism of 1960s and 70s. So he bringing all these elements together in his trilogy, and he is sort of incorporating all these, you can say, fables and myths together. So he's moving away from realism to myth and fable in his trilogy. Now he is also trying to sort of reiterate his belief in the postmodern uncertainties. So postmodern is an era of uncertainties. There is no, surety of anything. There is no certainty of anything at all. There is blurring of identity, uncertainty of, established norms, rules, regulations, forms, frameworks, everything. And he is again and again, he's emphasizing his belief in the postmodern uncertainties. And one of the characters in his novel, which is entitled Badlands, which was published in 1975. And one of the characters, he remarks, there are no truths, only correspondences, re-emphasizing the importance of Couret's technique of illusion and parallels, and his faith, most importantly, his faith in the postmodernism. So postmodernism elements can be easily, discerned in his writings. And obviously, postmodernism, promotes liberal thoughts, okay, liberal beliefs, and all kinds of, entities are promoted. There is no fixed identity, blurred identity, so you can live the way you want. You can live where you want. There is no restriction as such. So no established norms are there. So this is what postmodernism really refers to. So he obviously incorporates postmodernism elements in his writings, and situation in this novel is a deliberate inversion of Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. Okay, so almost he's inversing of what Mark Twain writes in Huckleberry Finn, and the action also patterned on a descent into underworld resembles Margaret Atwood's surfacing. So we find some of the elements which were described by Margaret Atwood in her book Surfacing, being reflected in his book also. Which is written by him, Couret's. Now Couret's another novel which is entitled What the Crow Said, which was published in 1978. Is an ironic reconstruction of a literary tradition of many myths of abduction of human beings by bees, birds, animals, etc. It's very interesting one. We never, hear about this, that bees and birds really abducting human beings. But here, he's sort of giving it a twist, giving it a new form of a narrative to the writing technique, okay. And by reducing his story to an elemental and episodic tale, he sort of is deconstructing the form of a novel. He is not following what generally people have been following in sort of, you can say, traditional form of a novel. So he is deconstructing the form of a novel which generally people have been doing, okay. Because generally we just listen to people abducting people, but here he isn't talking about that. He's talking about how even birds, animals, they are abducting human beings and giving it a very interesting twist to the story. Now during the 1970s, Couret turned to write poetry. So he was not only a novelist but a poet as well. And after 1970s, he got fascinated towards poetry and started writing poetry as well. While most of his short poems So he in fact published, he's published three books. Okay, one is collection of short poems, the other one is collection of long poems, and third one obviously will be dealing with this poetic progress. So first book is which was known as the Stone Hammered Poems, was published in 1975. Was obviously a collection of short poems. Okay, short poems, 1975. The second book which he published was a collection of long poems, which was published again 1975, which was entitled The Ledger. And the third book which he published was entitled, Field Notes. Okay, that was a collection of long poems. So, I mean, that really shows that he was not only a novelist, but he was also a well-established poet, And his other books of poetry are, such as Seed Catalog, the Sad Phoenicians. Okay, so they were published in 77 and 1979 respectively. So we see, I mean, a lot of, you can say, change is taking place in this field. So today we talked about, you can say, postmodernism element, post-nationalist elements. We talked about, you can say, differences between modernism, postmodernism, and I hope that today's lecture has given a very clear picture of what we understand by postmodern Canadian literature, or national Canadian literature, and it has really given you a clear picture of who are all the important novelists and writers and important poets of this Canadian literature. So that's it for today. I hope today's lecture has helped you to understand about postmodernism element and on post-nationalist elements. Thank you so much.